Hello, everybody. My name is Nancy. I'm the museum manager at the Mütter. Thank you for joining us tonight for this Neighborhood Stories event. Tonight we're doing Spitz-Spread's Death in Bella Vista with Jane Boyd, the historical curator on the exhibit Spitz-Spread's Death. And we're also going to have Peter Woodall, the project director at Hidden City, Philadelphia, who does a number of wonderful historical Philadelphia tours. Before we get started, there's just a few housekeeping items so that you know how to participate and ask questions. At any time during the webinar, if you have a question, you can drop it into the Q&A, which should be at the bottom right of your screen. Just type it in there. I'll either reply via text or Jane and Peter will answer it at the very end of the presentation. And we'll do as many questions as we have time for, so just be patient and we'll do our best. Without further ado, I'll introduce our presenters, Jane Boyd and Peter Woodall. We hope you enjoy this virtual tour of Bella Vista.
Hello, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. I was the guest historical curator for the Spitz-Spread's Death exhibition, and I am an independent curator and historian based in Philadelphia. These photographs show the exhibition that you can visit them. You can visit the exhibition if you're in the area. The museum recently reopened to the public, and the background that I'm in front of, my own virtual background, is a view of the Wissahickon Creek here in Philadelphia. And Pete, I'm going to introduce, he's the project director of Hidden City, Philadelphia, which explores Philadelphia's urban landscape through journalism and public history. And we would also like to acknowledge our colleague, Mickey Hare, who researched the family stories that you're going to hear on this tour. So, and we're happy to be able to share this virtual tour with you. It's the first in a series of 4 neighborhood tours, which we've adapted from in-person tours that we gave last fall. And we'll give you some information about the upcoming tours at the end of the talk. And these tours are part of a larger project called Spitz-Spread's Death, the influenza pandemic of 1918-19 in Philadelphia, that includes an artist project, a long-term exhibition at the Mütter Museum, and public programs like this one. And the reason we created this project was to commemorate the centennial of the deadly 1918-19 influenza pandemic that's often called the Spanish flu, and to explore its effects on Philadelphia, which had the highest pandemic death rate among major American cities. And we wanted to ask, what happens when a deadly disease strikes a crowded city? How do people cope? What do they feel and fear? And what would you do in the same situation? Last September, we held a memorial parade created by the artist group Blast Theory. More than 400 people marched up Broad Street to remember the pandemic's victims and to honor public health workers. Blast Theory's film of the parade is featured in the exhibition, which opened last October. Now, of course, major disease outbreaks happen frequently. We knew that over the 4-year run of this exhibition, there would be news headlines that visitors could connect to the events of 1918 and 19. But we did not anticipate that the project would become so extremely relevant so very quickly, and that we would be plunged into another terrifying pandemic with high death rates and an uncertain outcome. So I want to stress that this presentation today is not about COVID-19, but we hope that learning about how people dealt with a past infectious disease crisis can help a little bit as we struggle through this current crisis. So before we head virtually over to South Philadelphia, here's a brief overview of the pandemic and its effects on the city as a whole. This was one of the most deadly disease outbreaks in world history. It was called the Spanish flu not because it came from Spain, but because the disease was covered there in the press much more thoroughly than in other countries. Spain was neutral in World War I and didn't have censorship of the press like other countries that were fighting in the war. The global estimates of deaths ranged from 25 to 50 to 100 million. In the United States, about 25% of the population was infected, and about 675,000 people died. These are astonishing figures, literally off the charts, at a time when infectious disease deaths were declining because of advances in medical knowledge and public health practice. You can see that from this chart here. In terms of Philadelphia, there were about 2 million people in the city at the time. About a quarter of the population became infected. From our count of death certificates, at least 17,500 people died from fall of 1918 through the following spring. About 14,000 of those people died in 6 weeks in the fall. That's more than one death every 5 minutes. So among the largest American cities, only Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that only had about a third of the population, had a higher death rate. So Philadelphia was hit pretty hard. So Pete, do you want
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Is this my cue?
Yep.
All right, let's start. So Philadelphia is actually, especially compared to New York or Boston, it's a sprawling city of 143 square miles. And Broad Street, which is the north-south spine of the city, runs 13 miles within city limits. So the map you see here shows population from the 1920 census, and each dot represents 100 people. So you can see the most densely populated areas, including South Philadelphia. At the time of the pandemic, Philadelphia had an estimated population of about 1.76 million people. However, there had been a tremendous influx for war work of about 200,000 people. So the overall population of the city was nearing 2 million, and that was equal to Philadelphia's largest population, which happened in 1950. But of course, you know, the Northeast and the Southwest hadn't been developed yet. So what we saw was, especially the neighborhoods closer to the central core, were packed and overcrowded. Now, I think my first question when I became involved with this project was one shared by a lot of people. Why was the flu so bad in Philadelphia? Now, you know, we had poor sanitation, we had substandard housing, but so did, you know, pretty much every large American city at that time. What we had and what they didn't have was a massive parade for the Fourth Liberty Loan Drive on September 28th, 1918. It was to urge people to buy government bonds to support the U.S. involvement in World War I. Now, the virus had actually already arrived in Philadelphia prior to that. It arrived via Navy ship from Boston, which, you know, if you're a Philly sports fan, is another reason maybe not to love Boston, not that we needed more. And so by the time the parade happened, 600 sailors had already fallen ill, and the virus was loose in the city amongst civilians. There were warnings from doctors, but there was tremendous pressure to meet fundraising goals. And so the parade went forward, and 200,000 people jammed Broad Street. So that single event, which, you know, I think we now identify based on our recent experience as this tremendous super spreader event, was what really distinguished us from other cities. Of course, we also had overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, and an inadequate and slow government response.
Okay, so as the pandemic got worse, the horse got out of the barn, but the city did try to close the barn door. The state and the city reacted a bit too late, but they shut down schools, churches, saloons, and theaters, but they did not shut down all businesses because factories really needed to keep running to make supplies for the war. Philadelphia was an important part of the United States war machine. So in terms of response, we had taxi drivers, policemen, and car owners driving patients to the hospital. This photo on the left shows a masked policeman taking a victim to the hospital. Women volunteers staffed telephone switchboards and nursed the sick, and they ladled out soup. And in terms of a public health messaging, the city put up signs on streetcars and lampposts like this one on Market Street. You can see City Hall in the background there, telling people not to spit. Spit spreads death. Don't spit. Stop spitting. The reason for the emphasis on spitting, they knew that the disease spread by coughing and sneezing, but they also incorrectly believed that you could catch it by breathing in dust from dried spit on the ground. So this assumption, this mistaken belief about the spit being a vector sparked this public health messaging. Hospitals filled up within days as the pandemic spread like wildfire through the city. They established 10 emergency hospitals in buildings around the city. A lot of doctors and nurses were serving overseas, so there was a severe shortage of medical personnel. We don't have any interior photos of the Philadelphia emergency hospitals. They may have looked like this one in Oakland, California, which was set up in an auditorium. In terms of pathology, what the influenza virus does is it inflames the bronchial tubes and the lungs, and that makes them very vulnerable to other infections, especially pneumonia. Severe bacterial pneumonia combined with influenza caused most of the deaths in 1918-19. So doctors and scientists didn't know that influenza was a virus until the 1930s. There were no vaccines until the 1940s, and there were no antibiotics for pneumonia and those other infections. So the only thing doctors and nurses could do was really to treat the symptoms and provide supportive care. What you see on the left here is an illustration from a 1920 report on the pandemic, and it shows a flu patient with cyanosis, blue color in the face caused by fluid in the lungs and lack of oxygen in the blood. And the human lung specimen on the right shows the effects of pneumonia. The air sacs in the lower part of the lung were filled with fluid and pus, and they couldn't provide oxygen to the bloodstream. And this pandemic, this disease severely affected young people, maybe because their strong immune systems overreacted to the virus, or maybe because immunity from an earlier flu epidemic in the 1890s left them vulnerable to this new variant of the virus.
So I think with the current pandemic, we saw really strong calls, especially in the spring, to flatten the curve. And the reason for that was that the hope was not to overwhelm medical treatment facilities, but there was no flattening of the curve in 1918. Is that fair to say, Jane?
Oh, yes. Yep.
And so that caused tremendous problems with treatment, but also with burial. On an average day prior to the pandemic, there was maybe 50 to 70 deaths in Philadelphia. But at the height of the pandemic, hundreds of people were dying every day, and undertakers and cemeteries simply couldn't keep up. Caskets and bodies piled up all over the city, and years later, survivors recalled being surrounded by dead bodies as one of the worst parts of the pandemic. It really, I think, was a kind of horror that people experienced beyond simply being sick or dying. Catholic seminarians were enlisted as grave diggers at Holy Cross Cemetery and Holy Sepulchre Cemetery, which were both located outside the city. More caskets and boxes arrived daily from Philadelphia, and Catholic sisters from nearby convents cooked meals for the grave diggers, who worked for 5 weeks to bury all the caskets in temporary mass graves. The 100th anniversary of the pandemic, I think, well, we've been trying to do our part, but there's been plenty of other folks who have paid attention to this anniversary. And maybe that's gone a long ways to counteract what was, longstanding view, which was that this was the forgotten pandemic. In history books, it is often just a footnote to World War I, even though it killed many more people. We see a couple pictures here. We see the Alessandroni family, the mother and the daughter died there. And then we see the Wilson sisters, both of whom died. And what we notice is that, and Jane has mentioned this, is that the youth of the people who died made it especially painful and tragic. Of course, it's tragic when anyone dies, but there's something about death of a life that hasn't been lived. And then the disruption to society is greater as well. And there was I think I was thinking about it. There's at least 3, perhaps 4 or more public World War I memorials in Philadelphia to memorialize the soldiers who died, but there's not a single one for the victims of the influenza pandemic. So it was really up to families to remember and mourn very privately. So it was, you know, as much as the history was retained, it was through stories passed down through the generations that have preserved memories of the lost. Now, we've kind of given an overview so far, but now we're going to kind of magnify down to Bella Vista and look at how it affected that neighborhood in particular. So we're looking at Sanborn maps, or one is Sanborn, one is a public transit map on the left there. And in 1920, about 119,000 people lived in this area. And today, about 39,000 people do. So you can get a sense from that how much less dense it is now, how much more dense it was then. Bella Vista in particular, well, we can argue about the neighborhood boundaries, but and Philadelphians tend to enjoy doing so. But for my money, I would say that Bella Vista runs from 6th to 10th Street, east to west, and from South Street to Washington Avenue, north to south. So that's the little black square you see on the map on the left there. The colored map detail shows that area, although it doesn't quite get down to Washington Avenue. And that map on the right is a Sanborn Fire Atlas map. It was made in 1917. It is, for historians like ourselves, an absolute treasure trove of information. The atlas shows every building, from giant factories to tiny backyard sheds. It lets you know what the buildings were made of, where the water lines run for fire hydrants, and where fire hazards such as bakery ovens, which were often located, like Sarcones, we think originally, in the basement of rowhouses. Also shows you where gasoline tanks were located. It's just a remarkable resource. And as we look at it, hopefully you can see it close enough to tell. The red is brick, which makes sense. The yellow is wood, which also makes sense. And then the blue stands for stone, which I don't know if it makes sense, but that's what it is. There's really not a lot of open space, as you can see. The only real open space is a cemetery on the upper left and a couple of churchyards and schoolyards. Okay, so who lived in Bella Vista? We don't know exactly when these photos were taken, but they were taken by John Frank Keith. And he photographed mainly in South Philadelphia, and he took informal outdoor portraits of working class people. So we're using his photos to give you a sense of the faces you might have seen if you were walking around the neighborhood 100 years ago. Back then, more than half the people living in the northern part of South Philadelphia were immigrants or had immigrant parents. They were Italians, Eastern European Jews, Irish. African Americans were just 7% of the population. Although there was a African-American neighborhood just to the north, which was predominantly black. Many ethnic groups, much like today, had their own businesses and places of worship. Nearly 70% of Philadelphia's foreign-born Italians lived between South and Mifflin Streets and between Broad Street and the Delaware River. At first, the Italian-American community had few professionals, and many worked as tailors, shoemakers, barbers, or shopkeepers. Italy, the section of Italy that most immigrants came from was the South. The South was not industrialized, so it was perhaps natural that they didn't go to work in large factories. And in fact, there was much less heavy industry in South Philly than in other parts of the city. Although, yeah, Washington Avenue, it did have its factories and coal yards, and there was a major rail line down its center. Some of the Italian-born would have found work there, and also in the wartime industries, and as tailors, cutters, and sewers in the garment trades. Many of the men were common laborers rather than skilled factory workers, and were often employed on large public works projects. Women worked in shops and factories, and of course raised children at home. All right, so this is the first of our stops on the tour, or what would have been a real tour if destiny hadn't gotten in our way. This is South 7th Street between Fitzwater and Pemberton. And it's a small half block, but despite that, it actually had an Italian bank on each corner. And the buildings still stand, and they still have their bay windows. The building on the top in the map detail on the left in the photo is a private house. The one on the right in the photo, on the bottom in the map detail, now has a dry cleaner on the ground floor. And it's not a coincidence that there were two banks practically next to each other. An 1895 survey counted 25 Italian banks in the neighborhood, which seems by modern standards an absolutely flabbergasting total. Some were more decorative, like these. Others operated informally and discreetly out of saloons. Well, I mean, they weren't quite the banks that we know today. That's why there were so many of them. They did a lot more than hold people's money. Banks sold steamship tickets, sent telegrams, notarized documents. They dealt in real estate and served as employment agencies. These 1917 ads from a Philadelphia Italian language newspaper show the variety of the services offered. Another reason for the numerous banks: foreign-born Italians identified with the region they came from. Italy had only become a unified country in 1870. Those regional identities were still very strong, and so Calabrians associated with Calabrians, Sicilians with Sicilians, and so on. So now if we look at the Banca Bozell, which is really one of my favorite buildings in Philadelphia. I mean, I just love that clock tower. I love the date of construction that you can see. It's just a fun one, and I believe it was added to the Historic Register in Philadelphia recently. Lorenzo Bozzelli, he started out as a steamship agent. He arrived from Puglia in 1883 and built the Banca Bozzelli in 1893, and that's the date on the clock tower. And then, 10 years later, in 1903, the rival Banca d'Italia was built on the same block on the corner of 7th and Pemberton. By 1917, the Banca d'Italia had absorbed the Banca Bozzelli. And that's why the older Bozzelli building is marked S for store in the map detail. This building is labeled as a bank. It still has its doorway bearing the bank's name, and the doorway is actually cast concrete made to look like stone carving, which was very common at the time. Many churches used that technique as well. You know, at Hidden City, one of the things we've had fun with over the years is finding movie theaters that have been converted into other uses and figuring out, you know, how do you identify what used to be a theater? Well, South Philadelphia is really the only neighborhood in Philly where you can go looking for former banks in quite this way. You know, sometimes you'll see a corner building with elaborate ornamentation, with columns or a tower, and those are the ones that you want to go back home and check on your phone and see if they might have been banks at one time.
So for our second stop, we're going a little farther south to the corner of 7th and Catherine Street. And today there's basically nothing on this spot. It's just a parking lot. The Fleischer Art Memorial, which is a community arts organization, is down the block to the west, and you can see its tower in the photo. But a century ago, there was a building here. It was a model tenement or apartment house called the Casa Ravello. On the building's ground floor, there was a charity for infants called the Baby Saving Station. So in the early 1900s, there really wasn't much government assistance for the urban poor. So private charities tried to fill the gaps. And these charities were part of the settlement movement, which provided housing, nutrition, medical care, and educational opportunities. And these organizations also wanted to improve the behavior and quote unquote morality of their clients, and they also aimed to Americanize recent immigrants. So they have a kind of mixed legacy. Most of the houses in South Philadelphia were row houses, but there were some larger tenement buildings where people lived in really wretched, overcrowded conditions. And Casa Ravello was built in 1902 to offer improved tenement housing for the Italian-American community. And on its ground floor was this baby saving station, which was one of the many initiatives of the Star Center Association. That was a private charitable organization that focused on South Philadelphia. And in order to reduce high rates of infant mortality, the station provided free medical care and low-cost milk for infants. And in this photo from 1913, mothers and children are posing in front of the building, and the sign gives the hours of the dispensary and says when milk is sold. And in November 1918, the Star Center reported that, quote, during the recent epidemic of influenza, 9 or 10 of our babies died of it. Several expectant mothers contracted influenza, but none of them died, unquote. This is a very brief statement, but it shows how deadly the pandemic was for infants. And pregnant women also had high death rates, so it's fairly remarkable that none of those pregnant women in the Star Center's care perished.
Okay, to me, this is one of those almost quintessential South Philadelphia, Bella Vista blocks. Narrow, super narrow. When I was a kid, I used to worry that we were going to run into parked cars when we drove down them to go to the Italian market from West Philadelphia. This is the 700 block of Clymer Street. It's between 7th and 8th, below Fitzwater. And we're going to learn about some of the victims of the pandemic here. This block is typical, not just of South Philadelphia, but of row houses constructed in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Philadelphia was bragged about itself, in fact, as the city of homes, where a working person could ostensibly, and in many cases actually, afford to buy a row house, which was not the case elsewhere in America. Philadelphia's row houses seemed sanitary and humane compared to New York City's crowded tenement apartment buildings. But they had their own issues. They were just a little better hidden. Here's what the block looked like in 1917. D means dwelling, and S means store, with living space typically on the upper floors. The structures marked in yellow are wooden sheds, sort of a mudroom, typically in the back of the houses. Now today, each of these 3-story houses probably has 2 to 5 people living in it. I mean, parking is kind of tight, but then again, it's very desirable. You know, homes probably range somewhere between, I don't know, $300,000 to $700,000 at this point. I'm just guessing. But 100 years ago, census records tell us that there were anywhere from 7 to 14 people living in each house. There were multiple generations under one roof, and oftentimes unrelated boarders who were brought in for extra income. Now, there are about 45 houses on this block of Clymer Street, so there may have been 400 people living here on this one block, both sides of the street, you know, and you multiply that by the dozens of blocks in the neighborhood, and you start to understand, you know, even though it's a row house neighborhood and not a tenement neighborhood, you start to understand how densely populated this area was. Now, behind the houses, which were, you know, packed with people, were the backyards, and it would have looked something like this. It was a jumble of sheds, outhouses, and laundry lines. This photo was taken in 1923, 10th and Ellsworth, which is just south of Washington Avenue. Now, in 1918, you know, if you lived in a large house or a modern apartment building, and you were well-to-do, you had most of the modern conveniences we know today. So you had electricity, you had telephone lines, you had central heating and indoor plumbing. But these small row houses for working class people had none of those amenities. You know, if you were lucky, your house had its own cold water tap in the backyard shed and its own outhouse with a working toilet connected to a sewer line. And if you were not so lucky, you shared a water tap and outhouses with several other families, and the outhouses had filthy broken toilets or sat above privy pits that were not emptied regularly. Gas was for lighting only, and heat was from coal or wood stoves. This lack of sanitation, combined with overcrowding, contributed to high rates of infection and death in working class and immigrant neighborhoods like this one during the pandemic.
So as part of Spit Spread's death, we undertook a giant transcription project to transcribe the death certificates of everyone who died in Philadelphia over those 6 months and to track the flu deaths. And this data set shows at least 4 fatalities from influenza and or pneumonia on this block, with a few additional deaths that were probably related to the pandemic. And this is one of them. Her name is Giulia Italiano. She was a housewife who lived at 730 Clymer with her husband Pasquale. And she was just 24 years old when she died on October 4th. And that was the worst month of the pandemic in Philadelphia. There was another house on Clymer, 739, that saw 2 deaths just 4 days apart. And the first one was a baby girl, 5 months old, who died of influenza and bronchopneumonia on October 3rd. Her first name can't really make it out on the certificate, but she was the daughter of Daniel and Rose Caffaro, who were both born in Italy. And Daniel worked as a barber, one of those typical occupations. And on October 7th, we had the second death in the same house. Giovanni, or John Caffaro, also born in Italy. He was the brother of Daniel, who was the father of the baby girl we just saw. It was very common for siblings and their spouses and children to live together in the same household, oftentimes with parents as well. And John worked as a butcher. He was 24 years old and married when he died of pneumonia, and the doctor has written down Spanish influenza on the certificate, just 4 days after his little niece passed away. And he left behind his wife, who was also named Rose, like his brother's wife, a toddler son, and another child on the way. And that baby, born about 6 months later, was named John to honor his deceased father. So these are just 3 of those 17,500 pandemic deaths in the city. And there are stories like these on every single block. And the death certificates are like portals into these stories.
So our next stop is at the end of the block on 8th Street, just below Fitzwater. And this is Columbus Hall. And the Sanborn map shows that in 1917, there were stores on the ground level with meeting rooms for the hall on the 2nd and 3rd levels. It also shows that the building is brick with stone only on the facade, which is that narrow blue stripe that you see there. This building was originally a firehouse for one of the volunteer fire fighting companies of Philadelphia before it became professionalized and taken over by the city. It was the Moyamensing Hose Company. But in 1874, and forgive me here, my sister lived in Rome for 17 years, and she has a Roman accent, and I didn't. But I'm going to say in 1874, this Società di Unione di Fratellanza Italiana moved in. It was the first Italian mutual aid society in Philadelphia and the 3rd in the country after New York and San Francisco, and it was open to all Italians. The dates, which I think maybe you can see just barely at the top of the building, are 1867, which was the founding of the society, and 1897, its 30th anniversary, and perhaps when the stone facade was added to the building. It's interesting because later mutual aid societies were often limited to immigrants from specific regions in Italy, just as we saw with the banks. So this society was the product of an earlier and much smaller group of primarily northern Italian immigrants that settled around 7th and Montrose starting in the 1850s. Frankly, there just weren't enough of them, I would imagine, to separate themselves from each other. We haven't been able to find evidence that this society in particular provided post-epidemic assistance, but it seems likely nonetheless. The Società lasted until the 1930s. It would have been one of the things that they would have typically done, render mutual aid. We just don't have the documentary evidence to back that up. The building, had for recent decades been a restaurant, but very, very recently, in the last, I think maybe 4 years ago, it was turned into apartments. So our next stop, we're going on to 9th Street. That's the main drag for the Italian market, also called the 9th Street Market or the 9th Street Curb Market. And we're going to take a look at two landmark businesses, which are both over a century old, and they are Sarcone's Bakery and Ralph's Italian Restaurant. So we have a commercial district for well over 100 years now. And of course, many of the initial businesses created by immigrants involved food, whether it was corner stores, bakeries, butchers, restaurants, or even, and this is fascinating to me, small factories making pasta and other food products. Now, there's a lot of businesses out there, well, not a lot, but a few at least, that have been around for a very long time. But they almost never stay in the same place where they started. They'll tell you they're from 1875, but they won't tell you it's their third location. Sarcone's is the exception. As far as we can tell, it's occupied the same buildings the entire time, 756 and 758 South 9th Street, which is near the top of the map detail that you see there. According to the Sarcone family, Luigi Sarcone opened a bakery here in 1918, most likely prior to the epidemic, so prior to September. Luigi's son Peter learned to be a baker, who in turn taught his son Louis, or Louis, who grew up in these buildings with his parents and sisters. The business is now run by Louis' son and grandson, which makes it the 4th and 5th generation of Sarcones. I used to go to Sarcone's as a kid with my mother, and it was as good then as it is now. But the thing about it was, if you didn't get there soon enough, they'd be sold out of bread. And it was a real link to what life was like. It was so much more personal. Can you imagine if you went to, Safeway or Walmart or ShopRite and they said, "We're sold out of bread today. You came too late." I always loved that, even though it was disappointing at the time. But let's turn to Ralph's. Raphael Baldini founded Ralph's Italian Restaurant in 1900, 901 Montrose Street. So here's one of those movers. No offense to him. It moved to 760 South 9th Street sometime later. Certainly as of the 1920 census, the building was still listed as a boarding house. 1920, Baldini, a widower, lived next door at 762, which is to the left of the current restaurant, as is seen in this photo. In the same house were 3 generations of relatives that include sons, daughters, in-laws, a grandmother, and grandchildren. And they ranged in age from 95 years to 6 months old. And this wasn't unusual. The 1920 census shows that each of the houses on this block held several families with multiple children. So the commercial streets, weren't just for stores. They were as densely populated as the smaller residential streets like Clymer. Next, we're going to go to the Malatesta Republican Club, which frankly is one of the least prepossessing exteriors in all of South Philly. It's so bland and bare, and yet it has some of the most wonderful history. It's the brick building in the left center of the photo, second to left, I guess. And it's been remodeled or maybe even completely rebuilt since 1918. And it's on the right side of the map, detail marked as a store. But the upper floors would have been home to the Malatesta Republican Club, which had a really colorful history. It was named after and probably started by Giuseppe Joe Malatesta in the 19th century. And he was both a police captain, which was rare for an Italian at the time, and he was also a saloon keeper. And his bar on 8th and Lombard Street was famous for its wax figures of notorious criminals, which I just wish I could have seen it. I'm not sure if I've ever seen a picture of it even, but it sounds like a lot of fun. He died in 1900, but his club carried on. Now, it was neighborhood clubs like this one that provided the foot soldiers for the Republican political machine, which ran the city, and essentially traded jobs for power. South Philadelphia Italians were loyal to the Vare brothers, who were basically the bosses of the machine. They were state senators who grew rich on various municipal contracts, including garbage collection. And in return, the Vares hired thousands of Italian immigrants for public works projects, and in particular, the construction of City Hall and the building of the Broad Street subway line are well known as being primarily done through the labor of Italian immigrants. Now, you know, machine politics such as this are, you know, arguably fairly functional, if quite inefficient ways of governing under normal circumstances. An emergence shows a great weakness. It's a bureaucracy that is politicized rather than professional. I mean, in an emergency, that's deadly. And the city's public health infrastructure, which was primarily run by political appointees, was inadequate and couldn't cope with the demands of the pandemic.
So for our next stop, we're going to go just one house down from the Malatesta Club to the 900 block of South Darien Street. And it's a small alley, just 12 feet wide, too narrow for cars, even narrower than Clymer. And it's in the middle of the map detail. And you can also see around it that there are even narrower passages that don't exist anymore. So these small houses are called Trinities, or Father, Son, and Holy Ghost houses, because they're basically just 3 rooms stacked on top of each other. And the houses on the west side of the street, which still remain, are actually larger than the ones that used to be on the east side, as you can see from the detail here. And in the photograph, we're looking at 910 and 908. The small square houses across from them, built back to back, were probably just 12 feet square. You can just imagine how small that was. Some Trinities were even smaller, 10 feet square. These houses would have been just as crowded as the larger ones that we saw on Clymer Street, with multiple family members crowded into each room. And the houses with no backyards would have definitely have shared outhouses and water taps with many neighbors. It's somewhat remarkable that our records don't show any flu deaths on this particular block of South Darien, though there were a number of deaths in the immediate area.
Now, when you walk to the south end of this block of Darien Street, you'll find what used to be the site of a public bathhouse. Later, it was called Fonte Leon Pool, and it was built in 1905. Now, the pool got torn down in 2012, and recently an apartment building was constructed, and that history has been somewhat erased, unfortunately, because public baths are a fascinating phenomenon. They were basically an attempt to address the lack of indoor plumbing. And the city of Philadelphia built dozens of what were called quote unquote bathhouses, but were actually closer to an indoor swimming pool. Now, when we go back and look at the records, they were far more crowded in summer than winter, which probably means that the bathers, who it turns out were almost entirely men and boys, were using them to cool down and have fun rather than to get clean, although perhaps that happened as well. Confusingly, though, there was another builder of bathhouses, the Public Baths Association, which was a private charity, and they built 5 quote-unquote bathhouses, but they were actually showers, which also included facilities for washing clothes. Now, and several of those actually still exist. One is located just a touch north of Front and Gerard under the L, and it's been turned into a sort of a play facility for children, which is kind of neat. Now, initially, the city's pools were enclosed to keep out dirt that was in the air, and that was substantial, of course, back then when coal was the primary source of fuel. But of course, it also trapped heat and humidity, which led to bacteria and mold. So the roof of Fonte Leone Pool was removed in 1920, and it was used as a regular city pool until 2004, torn down in 2012. But it's not entirely gone, and I love the fact that a little chunk of it still exists at Cianfrani Park, which is at 8th and Fitzwater. There had been a seal over the entrance of the bathhouse / pool. Philadelphia Minetto, the city slogan, 2 female figures with a shield bearing the city's emblem, and that is located sort of at the east end of the park, in the middle of a garden, which you can see right there. I'm so glad that they saved a part of it. That unfortunately doesn't always happen like that.
Well, now we're back on Christian Street for our next to last stop. This is St. Paul's Roman Catholic Church, very large, handsome brick building in the Gothic style. This was the second Catholic church in South Philadelphia. It was established in 1843 for Irish immigrants. And as Italians moved into the neighborhood in the early 1900s, the congregation and its school became more mixed. There was some conflict between the older and the newer congregants. And St. Paul celebrated its 175th anniversary in 2018, and it still serves a changing immigrant population. Across the street from the church, there was the convent and school for the parish. The original convent is gone. There's just a parking lot now. But the school building, which you can see on the bottom in the map detail, has a charter school in it now. There is a smaller convent on the corner out of the picture that was built in 1923. So the convent comes into the flu story because 10 sisters from this convent helped to care for the sick during the pandemic. And they reported terrible scenes of deprivation and squalor with poor Italian families living in those overcrowded conditions we've been describing without food or fuel or bed linens or medicine. It seemed that people who were already living on the edge were really plunged into misery because of this disease. And for the final stop, we're going to be looking just to the left of St. Paul's at 4 row houses on Christian Street. And these houses together used to be a hospital, surprisingly. The one on the right has a dentist's office on the first floor, and the others are private homes. From the map detail, it looks like when it was a hospital, doors were cut through the walls to connect the buildings. So this hospital, which you can see in the background of the photo, was founded in 1904 by Dr. Giuseppe Fabiani. He trained in Italy, and later on he moved his hospital to 10th and Carpenter. And the advertisement from an Italian language newspaper shows all the different kinds of care that the hospital offered, caring for all different parts of the body, all different medical specialties, including syphilis in tiny type, which maybe you can see there. And the office and pharmacy were open day and night. And at this time, healthcare was mainly provided by doctors in private practice, private hospitals like this one, and public hospitals, including clinics like dispensaries, known as dispensaries, which the baby saving station was one of those. Fabiani probably operated on a cash basis, though some of his patients may have had sort of insurance through mutual aid societies and other fraternal organizations. So these death certificate records show that there were 9 deaths at Fabiani Hospital, and they all had Italian names, including this one, Joseph Uccioli, a 25-year-old medical student from Naples. He died of bronchopneumonia on October 9th, as the death toll was rising in the city. He may have been working at the hospital at the time, helping to care for flu patients. Many medical and nursing students were called into service during the pandemic since there was a shortage of medical personnel at the time. So we've seen what Bella Vista was like in 1918-19. It was an immigrant neighborhood, the center of the Italian-American community in Philadelphia, with these working class people living in these crowded, unsanitary conditions. And the northern part of South Philadelphia, which includes Bella Vista, had about 119,000 residents. There were about 1,460 pandemic deaths in the area for a death rate of about 1.23%. That's greater than the city average of 0.88%. So the pandemic had a significant impact on this neighborhood.
Yeah, I think, you know, when I look at South Philadelphia, the thing that really strikes me is how it's just the way its physical structure has enabled it to be a starting point for immigrants for, I guess we're up to 130 years now. The Bella Vista that's closer to Center City has certainly gotten quite expensive, but the parts of South Philadelphia, especially that are south of Washington Avenue, remain home to communities of Latinos, Vietnamese, Cambodians, Burmese, and that's sort of baked into the structure of the neighborhood that was established, you know, between 1890 and 1910. You have these small little row houses and small streets, and they're very modest, and they're places where people who don't have a lot of means can get their start in America. So I find that continuity to be really, really interesting. You know, I just don't think that much has changed. You know, immigrants today are fighting for the same things they always have, for, you know, a better life, for safe, affordable housing, for access to jobs, for healthcare, and educational opportunities, just like the Italians and other immigrants did here 100 years ago.
So here's some information on the upcoming tours we're going to do. On September 16th, we'll be looking at the African American community around South Street west of Broad. October 7th, we're going to go up to Brewery Town to talk about the German American community. And for our final tour on October 28th, we'll look at Irish Americans and mill workers in Kensington. So you can follow the Mütter Museum on social media for links and for notifications when the videos are posted. And in terms of thank you for joining us today, and these tours, we made them low cost so they could be accessible. And if you want to continue to help the Mütter to develop programs like this, become a member or donate, and certainly follow for all the latest information.
Yeah, and likewise, you know, please visit Hidden City Philadelphia's website. We've got hundreds of in-depth articles about the urban landscape, past, present, and future. We're just a small nonprofit organization that relies on its donors and members. And you can become a member and support our work that way. And, you know, we have a lot of fun on social media too, so check us out there. Thanks so much.
And last, but certainly not least, we want to thank our generous funders who made all the many, many parts of this project possible. Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the Groff Family Memorial Trust, and the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. And Pete and I also want to thank Mickey Hare, who worked with us to research the family stories for these tours. And if you go to the Mütter Museum website, you'll see more on Spitz-Spread's death, including a virtual tour of the exhibition from curator Anna Doty, museum curator Anna Doty, and online versions of the digital interactives. And if your family has a story about the pandemic from Philadelphia or the region, email it to us at this email address here, and we're going to collect them for an upcoming digital scrapbook. So that is our presentation, and I hope we have time for at least a few questions.
We do. Sorry, this is Nancy again, everybody. I don't think you can see me, but hopefully you can hear me okay. Our first couple questions have to do with the banks that we showed early on in the presentation. So I think Peter will probably be the person to answer those. And so one person, Heather, let us know or asks, at the Banca Italia portal at the top, was that also for a clock? It's got a kind of porthole window up there. Do you know if there was a clock there originally?
I don't. It certainly would make sense that you would replace a clock with a window. You know, the clock stops working, and you know, you have a different use for the building, and you know, you prefer a little more light, and you know, you've got to, you know, you don't need a clock anymore. But I'm not sure is the answer.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to tell with these things. I wish we had more photographs. So everybody take pictures of your neighborhoods and save them for us in the future. Future historians will thank you. The next question was, do you think that the vaults are still in the houses?
The which?
The vaults, the bank vaults.
Oh, that's fascinating. It's entirely possible, except I'm not sure that they all had vaults. They might have, because they were so small, they might have had freestanding safes.
Gotcha. I will say, I know of at least one bank in Gray's Ferry, a building that was a bank that does still have the vaults present. I think it kind of depends too on if some vaults were poured into, and safes as well, were poured into the concrete of the foundation, which makes them pretty hard to remove. So I'm sure it's possible, but I will knock on those people's doors and we'll ask them maybe one of these days.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I shouldn't dismiss it actually that quickly. I actually know someone who lives in Overbrook in a house, and there's actually a built into the house safe in that house just for the valuables that upper middle class family had. So
that's something that was also common in doctors' offices. One of my family homes actually has a safe, again, poured into the foundation, the concrete of the foundation. So. Right.
Yeah, no, it very well could be. That would be.
Yeah, but probably not a walk-in vault, hopefully. Well, that might be a cool game room or something if it was still there, but hard to say, I guess, would be the answer, right?
Yeah, hard to say, but possible.
Great. All right, our next question isn't really a question, it's just a note from Ralph Morano that says Banca Bozell is not yet listed on the Philadelphia Historical Register, but Banca Calabrese on 7th and Christian was recently added. So just passing that along.
Excellent.
Okay. Our next question comes from Jen, who asks if the bathhouses were still dirty once they got moved outside.
No, I mean, the water was the water, right? Like, I mean, yes, the air was much dirtier than it is today, but I think it performed its essential function, you know, despite that. Would be my guess.
Yeah, but better than nothing, I guess, kind of.
Yeah, that's where I'm kind of going with it. It's water, so water is always better than no water when you come in, you know, trying to get yourself cleaner.
Yeah. Okay. Our next question is, are the fire insurance, the Sanborn maps, are they publicly available? Can people find them somewhere to kind of scope out their own neighborhood or their own block?
Yes, absolutely. If they're actually in a couple different places, the Free Library has some of them online. The particular ones I'm using are from the Penn State University Libraries. So if you go to the Penn State University Libraries digital collections, they have something called a map. I think it's called the map drawer. If you just search for Sanborn, Philadelphia, then you'll find them, and they're super duper high res, so you can zoom in really close and get a lot of details. And there are keys in the beginning of each of the volumes that explain what all the symbols, different symbols, stand for. So it really is quite a amazing way to time travel. We use them for researching these tours to find out what was where 100 years ago. They do have some limitations in that they're not going to tell you whether a store was a grocery store or a barber shop or something, because they only care about fire hazards. So it's sort of, it focuses on those kinds of things. So it gives you a lot of information, but not necessarily everything you would want to know.
Great.
Right. If I could just add really quickly, just that there were a lot of other atlas publishers, and you can find them. The most prominent was Bromley, and you can find them on philageohistory.org, which is run by the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. And the great thing about it is that they have them back to, well, they have them earlier, but basically they have one from 1870, 1895, 1910, 1942. And so that enables you to kind of track what happened in the neighborhood over time. It's really fantastic. It's another one of our most important tools.
Yeah, they have them all digitized and overlaid and tiled, which is extremely time consuming, as I found out, to make this map. But so it's a wonderful, again, great way to time travel.
All right. Are there any other resources that you would recommend for people who want to look into this type of history?
Well, I mean, the Free Libraries digital collection is pretty extraordinary, as is Temple Urban Archives, which has the complete digitized archive of the Philadelphia Bulletin newspaper. So those are two great ones. I actually find a lot of helpful information on eBay even, because it's more of a just kind of messing around and goofing off on the internet, but you can pick up a lot through different old postcards and old business letterhead on eBay, and also like real photos of various neighborhoods. So even that can, you can find it almost anywhere if you know where to look.
The Philadelphia City Archives is another amazing collection. If you go to phillyhistory.org, they have thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of photos digitized and also geolocated. So you can search by neighborhood and find the images that they have there. The Library Company of Philadelphia also has a very excellent visual documentation of Philadelphia, particularly from the 19th century. So there's a lot of our local area collections have been digitizing like crazy and putting things out there for everyone to use, which is marvelous. We couldn't do our jobs to tell these stories without those incredible archival collections and the people who care for them.
No, absolutely. I mean, Hidden City couldn't have published the last 8 years without those resources. If we had to go down to the archives, in person each time, we'd be publishing once a month and not twice a week. So,
great. Well, thank you guys so much. I think we're going to wrap up. We were supposed to end at 6:30 and now it's 6:42. But I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. I will be saving any unanswered questions just to share with Peter and Jane so that we can hopefully better address any of them in upcoming neighborhood virtual tours. And once again, thanks for watching. Please feel free to visit the Mütter Museum online. We have a gift store. Visit Hidden City online. They have a gift store. I highly recommend their books for anyone who's looking for kind of a nice retail therapy pandemic experience and something really enjoyable to look at while you walk around the city. So thanks again. Thank you, Peter and Jane, for keeping us all informed. And hopefully we'll see you guys all at the next one.
Yep. Thanks so much for coming.
Take care.
Bye.